We are now in Chapter 3, the Government Accounting Process. The government accounting process is similar to a business entity, so hindi naman masyadong nagkakaiba ang process of analyzing, recording, classifying, summarizing, and communicating government transactions with what you have learned in your basic accounting subjects, except that it incorporates budget controls, such as recording of budget accounts, like appropriation, allotment, and obligation in the budget registries and the preparation of periodic budget accountability reports. So at the end of this discussion, you are all expected to know how to record basic transactions of a government entity and prepare a worksheet. So let us first identify the different books of accounts and registries maintained by government entities. So for the journals, or yung tinatawag na Book of Original Entries, so government entities maintain the following types of journal. First, General Journal, which is used for recording transactions which do not fit in the other journals. Cash Receipts Journal, for recording of cash receipts. Cash Disbursement Journal, in which all cash disbursement transactions are recorded. And Check Disbursement Journal for recording of check disbursement. For the ledgers naman, or the book of final entries, government entities maintain general ledgers and subsidiary ledgers. And for the registries, we have registries of revenue and other receipt, or ROR, registry of appropriations and allotments, or RAPAL, registries of allotments, obligations, and disbursement, or RAOD, registries of budget, utilization and disbursement, or RBUD. So these books and registries and recording in these books and registries will be discussed naman later. So the registries of revenue and other receipts is used to monitor budgeted amounts, actual collections, remittances, and other. The registry of appropriations and allotments naman is used to monitor appropriations and allotment. So this is to ensure that allotments will not exceed appropriation. So again, ang appropriation natin, ito yung amount authorized by legislative body na pwede natin gamitin for specific expenditures. So, yung ating allotment, which is the authority given by the DBM to incur obligations, shall never exceed yung ating appropriations as evidenced by the General Appropriations Act or the GAA. So, itong Registry of Appropriations and Allotment, this is the monitoring tool para makita na mamonitor na hindi nag-exceed yung ating allotment based doon sa ating available appropriation. So next, we have the registries of allotments, obligations, and disbursement. So this registry is used to monitor allotments received, obligations incurred against the corresponding allotment, and the actual disbursement made. So this is to ensure that obligations will not exceed allotments, while actual disbursement will not exceed the obligations incurred. So separate registries of allotments, obligations, and disbursements, or RAOD, shall be maintained for each object of expenditure. So for government accounting, meron tayong tinatawag na object of expenditure. So this object of expenditure simply correspond lang naman doon sa nature ng expenditure. So the classification of expenditures by object are as follows. So first, we have personal services. So this pertain to all types of employee benefits. So expenditures pertaining to employee benefits such as salaries, bonuses, allowances, cash gifts, and etc. So basta expenditures related sa pagbayad ng services ng personnel, so this will fall under personal services. Yung maintenance and other operating expenses naman, this pertain to various operating expenses other than employee benefits and financial expenses. Ano ba examples nito? For example, yung expenses incurred from traveling ng mga employees, utilities, pambayad ng mga utilities such as electricity, water, and pambayad ng supply. So this will all fall under maintenance and other operating expenses. For financial expenses naman, this pertain to finance costs and examples nito, yung mga interest expense na binabayaran, bank charges, and this will also include losses on foreign exchange transactions. So lastly, meron tayong capital outlays which pertain to capitalizable expenditures such as expenditures on construction of public infrastructures, acquisition cost of equipment, and etc. Usually ito yung mga PPE natin ng mga expenditures. So accordingly, the following separate RAODs shall be maintained for personal services, maintenance and other operating expenses, financial expenses, and capital. Lastly, meron tayo nung registries of budget, utilization, and disbursement, which is used to record the approved special budget and the corresponding utilizations and disbursement charged to retained income. So, katulad ng RAOD, separate our BUDs shall also be maintained for each object of expenditure. So, meron tayong our BUD for PS, for MOOE, for FE, and for capital outlays. Going back to the discussion in Chapter 2 about the budget process, so upon legislation ng ating national budget, appropriations are made to purposes specified in the budget, after which the DBM issues allotment to the government agencies which authorizes them to incur obligations within its obligational authority. So once allotment is received, government agency can now incur obligations in the form of entering into contracts, hiring of personnel, or purchase of supplies, which will be paid by the government. So these obligations will then be paid once the DBM issues disbursement authority to the government agency. So this process shall also be observed in the recording of transactions or the recording of government transactions. And actually, the government accounting cycle starts with the recording of appropriation. So using the illustration in our reference book, suppose entity A government agency receives its GAA or General Appropriations Act for the year 2021 consisting of 100,000 PS, 60,000 MOOE, and 200,000 capital outlays totaling 360,000. So how do we record this receipt of appropriation? So first, itong receipt ng appropriation will be recorded sa ating RAPAL or the Registry of Appropriations and Allotment, which is used to monitor na yung allotment natin hindi magsasobra sa appropriation. So if you can observe, medyo magkaiba lang yung form ng ating RAPAL gamit sa ating presentation as compared doon sa ating reference book. So by the way, this form is from the GAM. So this is the prescribed form by the GAM. So you can refer doon sa Volume 2 ng GAM na nakalagay sa ating Chapter 1 Supplemental Resources. So sa Volume 2 na yon, meron doong folder ng forms which are the prescribed forms na gagamitin in the government accounting process. And included doon sa forms ay yung iba't ibang registries na gagamitin natin in the recording of the government transactions. So going back doon sa ating appropriations na na-receive for entity A, so how do we record for the appropriations in the RAPAL? So lagay lang natin, ensure lang na malagay natin yung name ng entity A, and the fund cluster. So again, in government accounting, we follow the principle of fund clustering, wherein we cluster the funds based on their sources or based on the use of the fund. So since this appropriation came from the General Appropriations Act or the GAA, so ibig sabihin this is a regular agency fund. So how do we record the appropriation? So we just record the date of receipt of the appropriation with reference to the legal document or the legal basis for the appropriation, which is the General Appropriations Act. So let us say na may date yung GAA, and then lagay lang natin yung amount of appropriations received. So we receive 100,000 for PS, 60,000 for MOE, and 200,000 for capital outlay for a total of 360,000 appropriations. Okay? So after the appropriation, let's say for example, naka-receive na tayo from the DBM ng authority to incur obligation in the form of allotments. So how do we record allotments? The receipt of allotment is posted or recorded into two registries. First, in the RAPAL or the Registry of Appropriations and Allotment, and then in the Registries of Allotments, Obligations and Disbursement or the RAOD. So first, paano ba natin i-record yung receipt ng allotment sa ating RAPAL? So the allotment is recorded by posting the amount of the allotment in the allotment column. So dito, kung mapapansin nyo, ito yung ating receipt of appropriation kanina. And here comes, naka-receive tayo ng authority from the DBM to incur obligation in the form of allotment. So, let's say for example, January 2 na-receive yung allotment. And yung ating legal basis for the allotment is the GAARD or yung tinatawag natin na General Appropriations Act as a release document. And yung ating allotment na na-receive ay 90,000 for PS, 40,000 for MOE, and 170,000 for capital outlay with total allotment of 300,000. After posting the amount of allotment in the allotment column, then we will compute for the unreleased appropriation. So again, the purpose of the RAPAL or the Registry of Appropriations and Allotment is to ensure na yung ating amount of allotment will not exceed the appropriation. So again, this is a monitoring tool para ma-monitor natin yung ating amount of allotment as compared doon sa amount of appropriation. So given na yung ating received allotment or received allotment is 90,000 for PS from the appropriation of 100,000, meron tayong unreleased appropriation for PS na 10,000, 20,000 for MOE, and capital outlay na 30,000 with total unreleased appropriation of 60,000. So this is how we record the receipt of allotment in the Registry of Appropriations and Allotment. How about naman doon sa ating registries of allotments, obligations, and disbursement? Again, we maintain separate registries per object of expenditure. So again, yung ating object of expenditure, it refers doon sa nature ng expenditure. So naka-receive tayo ng allotment for PS. So we'll record sa raod ng PS yung na-receive nating allotment. So in the recording, entity name, fund cluster, legal basis ng allotment, which is the General Appropriations Act as release document, and then record lang natin yung allotment. Date ng allotment, this is January 2, and then allotment received for PS expenditures. Correspondingly, record natin yung allotment received for MOE and the capital outlay. So after the receipt of the allotment, so meron na tayo ngayong authority to incur obligation. So entity A can now incur obligation. And paano ba nag-i-incur ng obligation ng ang entity or ang government entity? This is through the issuance yung tinatawag natin na obligation request and status document. Okay? Or the ORS. So sa ORS, lagay lang natin yung ating expenditures. Let's say for example, ang entity A nag-enter siya into contract, job order contract for the purchase of office supplies and purchase of office equipment amounting to 70,000, 25,000, and 150, 160,000. So, paano ba natin piniprepare yung ating obligation request and status document? So, fill out lang natin yung mga needed information, entity name, sino yung payee ng ating obligation, office ng ating payee, and then address. And then, sa responsibility center, dito papasok yung office or yung unit na responsible or siya yung nag-request ng obligation. Siya yung nag-request ng expenditure. Kasi for example, yung job order for the employment contract na nag-request nun is human resources. For the office supplies and office equipment is the administration office. Nilalagay lang dito yung ating major final output or yung program and projects kung saan man siya related. Then yung UX natin object code which can be found doon sa ating revised chart of accounts. So yun yung parang chart na account number which is may kita sa revised chart of account and the related amount. Okay? So ano ba yung ginagawa dito? So the head of the requesting unit shall certify the necessity and legality of the obligation. So, sinicertify nung requesting unit, nung head ng requesting unit, yung necessity and legality of the obligation and the validity of the supporting documents. While the head naman ng budget office or yung budget division shall certify the availability of the allotment. So, to simplify, yung illustration natin, isang ORS lang yung ginawa natin for these three expenditures. Pero usually, may kanya-kanyang ORS ang kada expenditures. So, upon completion ng ating ORS, so, the items of expenditures are now obligated and these obligations are recorded na doon sa Registries of Allotments, Obligations, and Disbursement or DIRAOD. So, sa RAOD, yung incurrence ng obligation shall be recorded as follows. So, depende kung saang object of expenditure papasok yung contract na, or yung obligation na pinasukan ni entity A. So, let's say for example, for the contract of service or the job order contract, papasok siya sa personal service because ang expenditure is for the contract of service. So, how do we record the incurrence of obligation in the RAOD for personal services? Lagay lang natin siya sa obligations column and then get the difference of the allotment from the obligation and then meron tayong unobligated allotment amounting to 20,000. Kung mapapansin, yung ating obligations na 70,000 is still classified as not yet due undemandable. Bakit not yet due undemandable? Kasi nga, ito naman ay hindi pa siya complete transaction. Nag-enter pa lang ang entity A ng contract with the job order. Pero hindi pa complete yung transaction in the sense na hindi pa naman nasi-serve ng job orders yung service na kinontrata sa kanila ni entity A. Kaya hindi pa due undemandable yung 72,000. Inobligate pa lang yung amount na 70,000 pero hindi pa ito due undemandable. Kasi nga hindi pa naman nakakapag-serve yung mga job orders na kinontrata ni entity A. The same case with the MOOE, yung ating amount of obligated amount for the purchase of supplies na 25,000, hindi pa yon not due undemandable given na hindi pa naman nadi-deliver kay entity A yung supplies. So, magiging due undemandable lang yung 25,000, ibig sabihin, kailangan ng bayaran talaga ni entity A yung 25,000, here comes ma-deliver na yung supplies or complete na yung transaction. The same also applies sa capital outlays natin for the purchase of office equipment. Yung 160,000 is not yet due and demandable. Pero meron pa rin tayong unobligated allotment amounting to 10,000. So, paano naman if there will be a need for adjustment sa amount recorded in the RAOD and ORS? Okay? So, if the obligations recorded in the RAOD and ORS need to be adjusted, the subsequent adjustment shall be recorded or shall be made through the use of this what we call Notice of Obligation, Request, and Status Adjustment or the NORSA. So, the adjustment shall be affected through a positive entry or addition or a negative entry or reduction as appropriate. So, fill up lang natin yung form ng NORSA for the respective adjustment na kailangan natin gawin for the amount recorded in the RAOD and in the ORS. So, take note, up to this point, wala pa tayong nire-record sa ating accounting books. Okay? Again, yung ating mga budget registries, these are the responsibility of the budget officer or the budget unit or division of the government entity. So, mag-start lang yung ating accounting records once na nag-record na tayo doon sa mga journals. Journals in the form general journals, special journals, ledger, general ledger, and subsidiary ledger. Okay? So, again, the recordings so far are made on the budget registries. So, kailan lang ba papasok yung ating transaction sa record ng accounting? Okay? Kung mapapansin kanina sa ORS, in the recording ng ating obligation sa ORS, ang mga expenditures natin, obligated pa lang. Okay? Hindi pa sila talagang complete yung transaction. Okay? So, mag-start lang yung recording sa accounting records if yung employees na kinontrata ni entity A ay nakapag-render na ng services o if yung office supplies na pinurchase ni entity A ay na-deliver na at na-receive na ni entity A and yung equipment ay na-deliver na at na-receive na. So, this actually follows yung concept ng tinatawag natin na expenses recognition principle, which states that expenses should be recorded when incurred. Okay? So, the point of incurrence is the rendering of service and the receipt of supplies and equipment, where entity A now has the obligation to settle the sum due for the services and the goods received. So, only after these events occur that the entity's financial statement elements are affected and thus accountable events has occurred that needs to be recognized. So, kung mapapansin lang, yung government entities and business entities use the term obligation or the phrase incurrence of obligation differently. Kasi nga, under government accounting, ang obligation for government entity is the act of duly authorized official which binds the government to immediate or eventual payment of sum of money. Obligation may be referred to as a commitment that encompasses possible future liabilities based on current contractual agreement. While for business entities, obligation is another term for liability. Okay? For the government, ang obligation, hindi pa siya yung item for recognition in the accounting book. While for business entity, when we say obligation, it is an item na nire-recognize na sa book, which is liabilities. So, kailan lang mag-start yung ating recording sa accounting book? Once na na-receive na natin yung notice of cash allocation. So, once na-receive kasi yung notice of cash allocation, ang nangyari dito is na-receive na natin yung amount of cash that can be used to be disbursed in payment of the obligations. Okay? Or in payment of the expenditure. So, suppose na naka-receive na ng cash or nagkaroon na ng disbursing authority ang entity A or disbursement authority ang entity A in the form or evidenced by the notice of cash allocation. So, naka-receive siya ng 200,000 na Notice of Cash Allocation from the DBM. So, ito ay record na sa journal, specifically sa General Journal ni Entity A. So, how do we record yung receipt of cash? So, ito talaga ay accounting, accounting transaction since there is a receipt of resources na. Naka-receive na ng cash ang Entity A from the DBM. And yung recording naman natin ng receipt ng cash is similar lang naman sa natutunan nyo on how to record transaction nung basic accounting nyo. Okay, so this is the general journal. So again, this form is from the GAM. You can refer doon sa ating volume 2 of the GAM for the forms prescribed to be used for government accounting. So in recording the transaction sa ating general journal, record the lagay lang yung date of receipt of the cash, job number, which is this is the reference of the transaction, and a receipt of cash. So we will debit cash modified disbursement system regular. You will take note ang ating chart of accounts ay nakapaloob doon sa ating revised chart of accounts. Yung ating mga account names, account numbers to be used, nakapaloob lahat yun sa revised chart of accounts natin, which can be found sa ating volume 3 ng GAM. You can refer sa volume 3 ng GAM. Again, available sa chapter 1 resources natin, sa supplemental resources in chapter 1, sa Moodle for reference. So again, hindi tayo pwedeng gumawa ng sariling account name natin. Meron tayong prescribed chart of accounts by the GAM. So in the receipt of the notice of cash allocation or in the receipt of cash, we'll entry cash for the receipt of cash and then credit subsidy from national government for the revenue account. So the subsidy from the national government, this is a revenue account which is used to record receipt of cash from DBM. Okay? UAX code natin, ito yung account number and then the corresponding debit and credit amount. So this transaction is recorded to recognize the receipt of notice of cash allocation from the DBM. So after recording ng transaction sa general ledger, ipopost lang natin yung transaction doon sa general journal, ipopost lang natin yung transaction sa general ledger. Again, yung general ledger natin, we maintain ledgers for each account. So, since yung ating transaction kanina, it made an effect doon sa ating cash account, which is the cash modified disbursement system regular. So, post lang natin yung debit amount nung ating entry kanina doon sa journal, papunta doon sa ledger ng cash disbursement modified disbursement system, cash modified disbursement system regular. And then post natin yung credited amount doon sa revenue account natin, which is the subsidy from national government, sorry. So yun, after nung receipt natin ng cash, so meron na tayong pambayad ng ating mga expenditures. So, assuming na yung services contracted natin ng job orders, yung services na kailangan nilang ibigay na-render na, so kailangan nating bayaran yung services na na-render ng ating mga job orders. So how do we record yung ating payment of expenditures natin? Or how do we record yung mga disbursement natin? So for the first expenditure natin, which is the service, for the contract of service, so assuming na yung ating payroll composition is as follows. Salary and wages of 35,000 and may pera na 5,000 for a total compensation of 40,000. Pero yung ating payment will be net of the deductions. Meron tayong deduction na 10,000 for withholding tax, 2,000 for GSIS, 2,000 for pag-ibig, and 1,000 for PhilHealth. So these are the mandatory deductions na dinideduct natin from the payroll. So meron tayong net amount to be paid sa ating mga employee na 25,000. So how do we record yung ating disbursement ng 25,000 in payment of the services rendered ng ating mga employees? So assuming na meron tayong assuming na yung ating setup is papadaan natin siya doon sa ating disbursing officer. So usually sa government agencies meron tayong mga disbursing officers wherein sila yung mga authorized personnel na pwede lang mag-disburse ng pera ng government. So ang first na gagawin natin is to set up the payable to officers and employees after the approval ng payroll. So, set up natin yung payable para tayo ay makagawa ng cash advance doon sa ating disbursing officer in payment of this payable corresponding doon sa services ng ating employees. So, record natin yung expense recognize, which is yung services rendered by the employee. So, we will debit salaries and wages regular, pera, 5,000, with a credit doon sa deductions to be remitted later on din due to BIR, due to GSIS, due to Pag-ibig, due to PhilHealth. So these are liabilities natin. So mawawala lang tong liabilities na ito upon remittance ng mga corresponding deductions. So yung ating due to officers employees which is 25,000 which correspond doon sa net amount to be paid doon sa ating employees or the officers and employees. So after setting up the payable to officers and employees, post natin doon sa ORS natin sa Part C or sa Portion C na yung ating amount amounting to 40,000 is now due and demandable. Di ba kanina, sa pag-record natin ng obligation, yung buong 70,000 which correspond doon sa expenditures of contract of service natin with the employee is not yet due and demandable. Here comes na na-render na yung service and kailangang bayaran na yung service na na-render ng employees. This corresponding 40,000 na amount ng service na na-render ng employee is now due and demandable. Ibig sabihin, kailangan ng bayaran ni entity A. Next is yung ating pag-grant ng cash advance for payroll. Again, pinadaan yung ating payroll or yung pagbayad ng ating employee service is pinadaan sa ating disbursing officer. So, for the grant of cash advance for payroll, advances for payroll, which is advances doon sa disbursing officer with corresponding credit sa cash. So once na nakapag-record tayo ng ating cash advance to our disbursing officer, yung ating portion C ng ating ORS will be updated again to record na yung 25,000 of the due and demandable amount na 40,000 has already been paid. So meron na lang tayong 15,000 na due and demandable na obligation. After nun, post din natin yung payment sa section C or doon sa RAOD to reflect yung amount disbursed natin amounting to 25,000. So, same with the section C ng ORS, it will reflect na meron tayong due and demandable na 15,000 amount of obligation. Lastly, liquidate natin yung payroll fund. So, paano ba nil-liquidate yung payroll fund? Kapag yung disbursing officer is napamigay na yung amount to be received ng ating mga employees. So, kapag naipamigay na ng disbursing officers yon, the corresponding due to officers and employees will be extinguished. So, mawawala na yon since na yung liabilities na bayaran na, and then yung advances for payroll ay maliliquidate na rin. So, kung titingnan kanina, yung amount ng ating services ay net of the deductions. So, ang entity A, as the government entity, it is responsible din naman, or it is obligated to remit yung ating mga deductions doon sa ating mga other government agencies. So, yung withholding tax is to be remitted sa BIR, GSIS, deductions will be remitted to the GSIS, Pag-ibig deductions will be remitted to the Pag-ibig, and PhilHealth deductions will be remitted to the PhilHealth. Okay? So how do government agencies or entities remit their withholding taxes? So the remittance of withholding taxes through this what we call tax remittance advice, which is a used to recognize the constructive remittance of tax ng government agencies. So paano ba natin nasabi na constructive yung remittance ng government agencies of their withholding taxes? So using the illustration in our reference book for the entity A, notice that there is no physical transfer of cash to the BIR. Kasi ang nangyari, the debit and credit sa cash tax remittance advice was offset. Kaya ito sinabi na constructive. Actually kasi yung TRA na sinasabi natin, this is another form of disbursement authority. Thus, it is recorded similarly to the receipt of NCA. So, ang nangyayari, every remittance ng government agencies ng withholding taxes nila, nagkakaroon sila ng additional disbursement authority or subsidy from the national government. Okay? So, this means na yung government entity, specifically si entity A, may authority siya to use yung amount withheld niya from the services rendered. Say for example, itong 10,000 na withheld niya from the services, payment of services rendered by the employees. So, withheld ito ni entity A for the purpose of remittance sa BIR, pero ang ending kasi, hindi ito physically na transfer, itong 10,000 na amount na withheld is hindi siya physically na transfer kay BIR. Ang nangyari, nagkaroon ng constructive remittance wherein on the amount of 10,000 is naging additional disbursement authority ito ni entity A, which is itong 10,000 na withheld niya for taxes is nagkaroon siya ng authority na gamitin ito for other purposes related sa kanyang operations. So, amount used from the TRA will be reported kay entity A's monthly report of disbursement. On the other hand, yung remittance naman ng other deductions to be remitted sa mga other government agencies is recorded as follows. Siyempre, i-recognize lang natin yung liability for the deductions due to GSIS, due to Pag-ibig, due to PhilHealth with corresponding credit to cash. So, unlike sa remittance ng tax, ang remittance ng other deductions na to be remitted sa other government agencies is there is a transfer of cash or there is a physical flow of cash, unlike the TRA. How do we record naman billings, collections, and remittances? So, suppose entity A bills revenue of 100,000 for rent income. So, the entity to record the transaction is a debit. Say for example, billing pa lang ito, hindi pa nababayaran. Pero it is a revenue na. So, applying the income recognition principle, so income are recognized when earned regardless of when received. So, debit natin yung receivable account with corresponding credit doon sa income account, which is rent or lease income. Pagdating naman ng collection, debit natin yung cash with the credit doon sa receivable account, after which, yung ating cash collected by the collecting officer shall be remitted doon sa agency deposit or treasury. So PD number 1445 or Presidential Decree number 1445 requires that all collections must be remitted to the National Treasury unless another law specifically allows otherwise. So the billing of revenue is recorded in the General Journal while the collection and remittance are recorded in the Cash Receipts Journal. So this is an example of recording in the Cash Receipts Journal. So again, the Cash Receipts Journal is a special journal used to record all cash receipts transactions. So in recording naman dito, natutunan na rin naman natin ito nung basic accounting. So anong mangyayari kapag nagkaroon ng unused na notice of cash allocation? So yung notice of cash allocation, again, yun yung amount of cash received for the purpose of paying the incurred obligations ng entity. So, hindi naman kasi at all times is na utilize yung ating notice of cash allocation at 100% or hindi ito na utilize in full. So, anong nangyayari kapag ang ating notice of cash allocation by the end of the quarter ay may naiwan na unused portion? Simple lang, ang mangyayari dito is ibabalik natin yung unused portion ng notice of cash allocation pabalik sa Bureau of Treasury. So, ang entry ng ating receipt of notice of cash allocation is a debit to cash and a credit to revenue account which is subsidy to national government. So, reverse lang natin yung entry. So, ang entry natin to revert back the unused notice of cash allocation to the Bureau of Treasury is to recognize sa book yung ating cash and then reverse yung revenue account initially recorded. Okay? So, kailan ba tayo nag-revert ng unused notice of cash allocation? So, today, currently, ang practice is ang ating notice of cash allocation shall be utilized within the quarter. So, meron tayong quarterly receipt of notice of cash allocation. So, once na by the end of the quarter, hindi na-utilize yung NCA for the quarter, the remaining portion of the NCA or the unused portion of the NCA shall be remitted or shall be reverted back to the Bureau of Treasury at the end of the quarter. So, let's say for example, entity A, after the end of the quarter, hindi niya na-utilize yung 170,000 na notice of cash allocation. So, to recognize yung reversion ng unused notice of cash allocation, again, recognize lang natin or reverse lang natin yung entry when we recorded the receipt of notice of cash allocation, which is mag-debit tayo sa subsidy from national government and i-credit to cash modified disbursement system regular. So ngayon, i-summarize lang natin yung ginawa natin na recording of government transaction. So again, nagsa-start yung ating government accounting with the receipt of appropriation, which is recorded sa ating budget registry. So, ang ating appropriation is recorded in RAPAL, after which, kapag naka-receive tayo ng authority from the DBM to incur obligation, yung allotment ay nire-record natin sa RAPAL and sa appropriate RAODs ng mga expenditures natin. Again, ang RAOD natin is per object of expenditure. After which, kapag nag-incur na tayo ng obligation, may authority na tayo to incur obligation. So, ang entity, government entities can now incur obligation through the issuance of ORS and subsequent recording nito sa appropriate RAODs. So, kapag nakapag-incur na tayong obligation, yung ating disbursement authority shall now be received in the form of NCA. And this NCA are recorded in the RANCA. So, take note, again, from appropriation to incurrence of obligation, hindi pa ito accounting records. Kung papansin, ang ating appropriation, allotment, up to incurrence of obligation, these are recorded lang sa ating budget registries, which are the responsibility of the budget office or the budget division of the government agencies. So, mag-start ang accounting recording o records ng accounting from the receipt of the notice of cash allocation or the receipt of the cash. So, the receipt of the cash or the receipt of the notice of cash allocation shall be recorded sa journal with the debit to cash and credit to subsidy from national government and subsequently be posted sa ating ledger. After receipt ng notice of cash allocation, pwede na tayo magbayad ng disbursement. So, update lang natin yung ating ORS, portion ng ORS for the payment and ang appropriate RAODs with corresponding entry sa journals and subsequent posting sa ledgers. So, for the tax remittance naman, ang ating tax remittance for government agencies is made through the tax remittance advice, which is actually a constructive remittance of tax kasi wala namang physical flow ng cash. Ang nangyayari lang, the amount of tax to be remitted sa BIR ay nagiging additional disbursement authority ng government agencies wherein nagkakaroon sila ng additional subsidy from the national government or from the Bureau of Treasury wherein pwede nila itong gamitin in other purposes related to their operation. For billings and collection, and again, pag merong unused portion ng NCA at the end of the quarter, which is the normal period for the utilization of the NCA, the remaining unused portion shall be reverted back doon sa Bureau of Treasury. So we have here the revised chart of accounts, so there is no need to discuss this in detail. So you can refer na lang doon sa ating volume 3 ng GAM. So yung volume 3 ng GAM natin, this covers all information related sa ating revised chart of accounts. So to give you a simple discussion lang about our revised chart of accounts, so actually itong revised chart of account natin, this contains all the account names and the account codes or account numbers which shall be used in recording of the transactions ng government agencies. So yung ating revised chart of accounts, yung chart numbers or account numbers ng ating accounts is composed of 8-digit numbers which correspond to the first digit is for the account group, whether the account is asset, liabilities, equity, income, and expense. The second two digits of the UAX code is the major account group. Major account, kung ito man ay, kung asset ito ay cash equivalent, kung ito ay inventory, kung ito ay receivable, and so on. For the 2, 4th, and 5th digit, correspond doon sa ating sub-major account group. Sub-major account, for example, sa cash and cash equivalent is cash on hand, cash on bank, petty cash fund, and so on. For the 6th and 7th digit, this will refer doon sa general ledger account, kung ito ay cash collecting officer, and so on. And then the last digit will correspond doon sa ating general ledger accounts, kung ito ay contra accounts, kung ito ay contra accounts such as allowance and accumulated depreciation. So to end, let me give you an overview of the complete government accounting cycle. So again, the government accounting cycle starts with appropriation, followed by allotment, incurrence of obligation, disbursement authority through NCA, disbursement, billing collections and remittances, preparation of an adjusted trial balance, adjusting entries, closing entries, and the eventual preparation of financial statements. So again, The government accounting process is similar din naman to that of a business entity. Ang pinagkaiba nga lang talaga nila is meron tayong budgetary controls which involve recording in the budget registries. Accounting for revenues, disbursements, and other accounts will be discussed in detail in the succeeding topics. But in this chapter, we had a general discussion for the first 6 steps, and the steps 7 to 10 are already learned na rin naman from the basic accounting subject. So, you may refer na lang sa example natin sa ating reference book from page 76 to 98 for a clearer view of the government accounting cycle. So, that would be all for this discussion.